Hello. As promised, this is Bedroom Horror. And today's book, in case you were wondering, is called The 120 Days of Soldering. Okay, I'm not going to do the voice for the whole thing. I just needed a character, I guess, because I don't want to be seen with this thing. That's also why, the mask and the suit and all that. But I invited a few people to watch. They're not currently watching. But whatever, that's fine. Either way, I'll have something recorded and at least something to show for the fact that I actually went into the meat and potatoes of one of the worst books ever written. But with all of that said, a quick preamble before we get into things. If you ask me to stop bullshitting you and getting into the, meat of things, trust me, you're going to wish we stayed in the preamble. But basically, the whole reason why I am doing this is because a long time ago, I had a chicken measuring contest with my cousin, King Kadora on YouTube. And we talked about what is the worst movie you've ever seen or whatever. And it's like, oh, mine's worse, mine's worse, mine's worse. And I talked about something called Solo. And he showed me something called a Serbian film. That's the one. He won the bet, but I always considered mine to be worse. And eventually, I looked into it a bit more. There's a guy called Wendigoon on YouTube, and he said that Solo was based off of a true story. It isn't. It's based off of this book, written in the 1700s around. This book is technically older than the founding of America. Yes, middle 1700s. And it was written by the man for which the word sadism comes from. He wrote it while he was in prison, and now we have it here. And let me just read off of the back. The 120 Days of Soldering by the Marquis de Sade relates the story of four wealthy men who lock away 24 mostly teenage victims and play bowling with and have wine tastings with them while listening to the stories of old ladies of the night. The book was written while Sade was imprisoned in the Bastille, and the manuscript was lost during the storming of the Bastille. Sade wrote that he wept tears of blood over the manuscript's loss. Many consider this to be Sade crowning achievement. It doesn't even have a possessive S. There's a fail for you. So even the back of the book is just written terribly. But that's just how things go. Honestly, I wouldn't want this to be an official thing, and I wouldn't want this to be, made well. Honestly, the reason why I'm reading this and the reason why it's the scariest thing or whatever, and the reason why this is happening in October is because, well, just to cover my tracks here, I looked out this book and I read it and I needed something to show for it. So here's the video. But also, in case you're thinking, well, this isn't scary, it's disgusting, but it isn't scary, what's scarier than this? There are many stories written by people like Frank Miller or Mark Millar or friggin', I don't know, pick someone who made a horror movie. They usually make them with the understanding that these things are terrible and deserve ridicule, or that the people don't deserve what they get. But this was written not with that feeling in mind, but with lust, with the fact that these things are good and should happen. And you really get the feeling of that while you are reading this. And if that doesn't terrify you, then shit, I'm terrified of you. Anyways, here's the book. The 120 Days of Soldering. Yes, I will be self-censoring. I need my YouTube channel. Go away. Okay. Let's get into a good position. There we go. Much better. Damn, the camera cannot focus on me, can it? Whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm glad it can't see me. Fuck you. I mean, forget you. I'm already losing this channel. The extensive wars wherein Louis XIV was buried during his reign while draining the state's treasury and exhausting the substance of the people, nonetheless contained the secret that led to the prosperity of a swarm of those bloodsuckers who are always on the watch for public calamities which, instead of appeasing, they promote or intend so as, precisely, to be able to profit from them the more advantageously. The horror settles in, but trust me, it gets worse. This is just the setup, I guess. I don't know how to do this mic, but whatever. The end of this so very sublime reign was perhaps one of the periods in history of the French Empire when one saw the emergence of the greatest number of these mysterious fortunes, whose origins are as obscure as the lust and debauchery that accompany them. It was toward the close of this period, and not long before the regent sought, by means of the famous tribunal which goes under the name of the Chambre de Justice, to flush the multitude of these traffickers, that 4 of them conceived the idea for the singular revels whereof we are going to have an account. Basically, the French Revolution happened, and now there are 4 noblemen who basically know that they're going to get their heads chopped off. So they're like, whatever, caution to the winds, we're going to enjoy ourselves. One must not suppose that it was exclusively the low-born and vulgar sort which did this swindling. Gentlemen of the highest note led the pack. The Duc de Blanges and his brother, the Bishop of X. It's X and then a bunch of underscores. I don't know. Each of whom had the thus wise amassed immense fortunes, I don't know, are in themselves solid proof that, like the others, the nobility neglected no opportunities to take this road to wealth. These 2 illustrious figures, though their pleasures and businesses closely associated with the celebrated Durset and President de Serval, were the first to hit upon the debauch we propose to chronicle, and having communicated this scheme to their 2 friends, all 4 agreed to assume the major roles in these unusual bowling tournaments, we will say. I'm sorry if the audio sucks. I don't know how to fix that. For above 6 years, these 4 libertines, Wikipedia says that it basically just means playboys, but like it's an old-fashioned way of saying it. F this mask, I need to... These libertines, kindred through their wealth and tastes, had long since thought to strengthen their ties by means of alliances in which debauchery had by far a heavier part than any other of their motives, that ordinarily serve as a basis for such bonds. This certainly reads as something that was written in a prison. What they arranged was as follows. The Duc de Blanges, thrice a widower and sire of 2 daughters, 1 wife, had given him, had noticed that the President de Serval appeared interested in marrying the eldest of these girls. Despite the familiarities he knew perfectly well, her father had indulged in her. Oh. Yeah, familiarities. That censored itself. Despite the familiarities he already knew. Okay. The Duke, I say, suddenly conceived the idea of a triple alliance. You want Julie for your wife, said he to Serval. I give her to you unhesitatingly, and put one condition to the match, that you will not be jealous when, although your wife, she continues to show me the compliances she always has in the past. What is more, I'd have to lend your voice to mine in persuading our good Dorset to give me his daughter, Constance, for whom I must confess I have developed roughly the same feelings you have formed for Julie. It only gets worse. But, said Serval, you are surely aware that Dorset, just as a libertine as you, I know all that's to be known, the Duke rejoined. In this age, and with all our manner of thinking, is one halted by such things. Do you think I seek a wife in order to have a mistress? I want a wife that my whims may be served. I want her to veil, to cover an infinite number of our little secrets, the debauches the cloak of marriage carefully conceals. In a word, I want her for the reasons you want my daughter. Do you fancy I am ignorant of your object of desires? We libertines wed women to hold slaves. As wives, they are rendered more submissive than mistresses. And you know the value we set upon despotism in the joys we pursue. So basically, he wants a beard and a, a housekeeper, a maid, basically. Good lord. Just get this. I don't know how to tighten that. Whatever. It was at this point Dorset entered. His two friends related their conversation, and delighted by an overture of which promptly introduced him to avow the sentiments he had too conceived for Adelaide, the President. Dorset accepted the Duke as his son-in-law, provided he might become Serval's. These three marriages were speedily concluded. The dowries were immense, the wedding contracts identical. No less culpable was than his two colleagues, the President had admitted to Dorset, who betrayed no displeasure upon learning that he maintained a little clandestine commerce with his own daughter. The three fathers, each wishing not only to preserve his rights, but noticing here the possibility of extending them, commonly agreed that these three young ladies, bound to their husbands by goods and homes, would not in body belong more to one than to any of them, and the severest of punishments were prescribed for her who would take it into her head not to comply with any of these conditions, whereunto she was subjected. They were on the eve of realizing their plan when the Bishop of X, already close-bound through pleasure, shared with his brother's two friends, proposed contributing a fourth element to the alliance, should the other three gentlemen consent to his participation in the affair. They married the women. Cool. They married each other's daughters. That's wow, okay. That's how it starts. That's how it friggin' starts. The element, the Duke's second daughter and hence the bishop's niece, was already more thoroughly his property than was generally imagined. He had effected conditions with his sister-in-law, and the two brothers knew beyond all shadow of a doubt that the existence of this maiden, who was called Aline, was far more accurately to be ascribed to the bishop than to the duke. The former, who, from the time she left the cradle, had taken this girl into his keeping, had not, as many would suppose, stood idle as the years brought her charms to flower. And so upon this head he was his colleague's equal, and the article he offered to put on the market was in the equal degree damaged or degraded, but as Aline's attractions and tender youth outshone even those of her three companions, she was unhesitatingly made a part of the bargain, as had the other three. The bishop yelled her up yielded her up, but retained the rights to her use. Ugh. So, yes, you can marry my daughter, but I still get to go bowling with her. And so each of our four characters thus found themselves husbands to four wives. Thus there resulted arrangement, which for the reader's convenience we shall recapitulate. So here's how they were married. The Duke, Julie's father, became the husband to Constance, Dorset's daughter. Dorset, Constance's father, became the husband to Adelaide, the president's daughter. The president, Adelaide's father, became the husband to Julie, the Duke's eldest daughter, and the bishop, Aline's uncle and father, became the husband of the other three females by conceding this other three females by conceding the same Aline to his friends, the while retaining the same rights over her. That's just confusing, but basically, one dude got to marry three women. Cool. It was at a superb estate that the Duke, situated in the Bourbon, I have no idea how to say that these happy matches were made, and I leave to the reader to fancy how they were consummated and in what bowling tournaments. Obliged as we are to describe others, we shall forego the pleasure of picturing these. Thank goodness. The less we have of this, the better, I say. Upon their return to Paris, our four friends associated. Our four friends, really? Association became only the firmer, and as our next task it is to make the reader familiar with them, before proceeding to individual and more searching developments. A few details of their lubricious arrangements will serve. It seems to me to shed I don't know where to put this mask. Whatever, I put it there. It's getting in the way. It's the whole thing. Whatever, I don't know if it's going to make me sound different. I don't know. Okay. Upon their return to parents, blah, 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 blah. Before proceeding to individual and more searching developments, a few details of the lubricants will serve, it seems to me, to shed a preliminary light upon the character of these debauches. The society had created a common fund, which each of its members took his turn administering for 6 months. The sums allocated for nothing but expenses in these interests of pleasure were vast. Their excessive wealth put the most unusual things within their reach, and the reader ought not to be surprised to hear that 2,000,000 were annually disbursed to obtain good cheer and lust satisfaction. 4 accomplished procuresses to recruit women, and a similar number of pimps to scout out for men. Here we go. Have the sole duty to range both and the capital and the provinces and bring back everything, in the one gender and in the other, that could best satisfy their sensuality's demands. 4 super parties were held regularly every week in 4 different countries' houses, located at 4 extremities of Paris. At the first of these gatherings, the one exclusively given over to pleasures of soldering, other men were present. There would always be at hand 16 young men arranged in age from 20 to 30, whose immense faculties permitted only our 4 heroes, in feminine guise, to taste the most agreeable delights. Ew. Look, okay. Before you say anything, yes, I'm a very sex positive guy, but this is gonna get really weird really quick. And I said ew because I know where this goes eventually. And you'll get it. The youths were selected solely upon the basis of their size of their chickens, and it almost became necessary that the superb limb be of such magnificence that it could never have pecked at any woman. This was an essential clause, and as naught was spared by way of expense, only very rarely would it fail to be fulfilled. I forgot how to read. That is tragic. I have way more of this to go. But simultaneously to sample every pleasure to these 16 husbands was joined the same quantity of boys, much younger, whose purpose was to assume the office of women. Here we go. These lads were from 12 to 18 years old, and to be chosen for service each had to possess a freshness, a face, graces, charms, an air, an innocence, a candor, which are far beyond what our brush could simply paint. No woman was admitted to these masculine wine tastings. No. Bowling tournaments, right. I'm getting my friggin' censoring words mixed up. In the course of which everything of the lewdest invention in Sodom and Gomorrah was executed. Okay. At the second supper were girls of superior class, upon these occasions forced to give up their proud ostentation and the customary insolence of their bearing, were constrained in return for their hire to abandon themselves to the most irregular caprices, and often even to the outrages of our libertines, were pleased to inflict upon them. 12 of these girls would appear, and as Paris could not have furnished a fresh supply of them as often would have been necessary, these events of interest, of intierce, were interspersed. What? There's a space here. I don't know. With others at which were admitted only in the same number as these it's not a thing. Only in the same number of these well-bred ladies, women ranging from procuresses up to through the class of officers' wives. These are above 4,000 or 5,000 in Paris, who belong to one or to the other of the latter classes, and of whom need or bowling skills obliges to attend soirees. To attend soirees of this kind, one has but to have good agents to find them, and our libertines, who are splendidly represented, would frequently come across miraculous specimens, but it was in vain. One was honest or a decent woman. One had to submit everything, our lordship's libertinage, of a variety that never brook limits, would overwhelm with horrors and infamies, whether by nature or social convention ought to have been except for such ordeals. Once one was there, one had to be ready for anything, and as our 4 villains had every taste that accompanies the lowest, most crapulous of debauch. Crapulous. I gotta remember that one. Of debauch. How was that? This fundamental acquiescence to their desires was not by any means a matter of inconsequence. The guests at their third supper were the vilest, foulest creatures that could possibly be met with, to who has some acquaintance with debaucheries. My voice is, my mouth is dry. It's a terrible thing. I might need to get some water or something. I don't know. To him who was some acquaintances with debaucheries, extravagances, this refinement will appear wholly understandable. 'Tis most voluptuous to wallow, so to speak, in filth with persons of this category. Guys, I gotta be honest, some of this is going way over my head, just in the realm of all this fancy talk. So if my self-censoring isn't working, uh, I'm sorry. I just don't know. These exercises offer the completest abandon, the most monstrous intemperance, and the total abasement. And these pleasures, compared with those tasted the evening before, or with distinguished individuals in whose company we have tasted them, have a way of lending a sharp spice to earlier activities. At these third suppers, debauch being more thorough, nothing was omitted that might render it complex and piquant. I don't know. Do you know? Do you know? I don't know. Piquant. Piquant. Piquan. Piquan. 100 ladies of the night would appear in the course of 6 hours, and only too often something less than the full 100 would leave the games. But there is nothing to be gained by hurrying or story, or by approaching subject which can only serve adequate treatment in the sequel. As for the fourth supper, it was reserved for young maids. Only those between the ages of 7 and 15 were permitted. Their condition in life was of no importance. What counted was their looks. They had to be charming. As for their virginity, authentic evidence was required. That is, what evidence? The hymen can heal. Fun fact. Evidence. Jesus. Oh, incredible refinement of libertinage! It was not absurdly that they wished to pluck all these roses. And how indeed could they have done so? For those untouched flowers were always a score in number, and only 4 libertines, only 2 were capable of proceeding to the act, and 1 was of the remaining 2, the fancier being more absolutely incapable of a clucking chicken, and the bishop being absolutely unable to take his pleasure, save in a fashion which, yes, I agree, may dishonor a untouched flower, but which, however, always leaves his perfectly intact. Oh, he has a very small chicken. How sad. No matter, the 20 maidenheads had to be there, and be there or be square, I guess, I don't know. And those which were not impaired by our quartet of masters became before their eyes the prey of certain of their valets, just as depraved as they, whom they kept constantly at beck and call for more than one reason. Apart from these 4 supper parties, a supper party. Just call it a dinner party like a normal person. Good Lord. There was another. No, there is another. A secret and private one, held every Friday, ou do tell, involving many fewer persons, but surely consisting a great deal more. The participants were restricted to 4 young and high-born damsels, who, by means of strategy and money, had been taken from their parents' homes. Our libertines' wives nearly always had to share in this debauch, and their extreme submissiveness, their docile attentions, their services made it more of a success each time. As for their genial atmosphere at these suppers, it goes without saying that even further profusion, that delicacy reigned there. Not one of these meals cost less than 10,000 francs, and neighboring countries as well as all of France was ransacked, so that was of the rarest and most exquisite might be assembled together. Fine and abundant wines and liqueurs were there, and even during the winter they had the fruits of every season. In a word, one may be certain that the table of the world's greatest monarch was not dressed with as much luxury, nor served with equal magnificence. Sod likes his run-on sentences, doesn't he? Sorry if that's annoying. I just needed a few breaths. But now let us retrace our steps and do our best to portray one of each of our four heroes. To describe each of them in terms of the beauty, not in a manner that would seduce or captivate the reader, but simply as the brushstrokes of nature which, despite all disorder, is often sublime, indeed, even when she is at her most depraved. For, why not say so in passing? If the crime lacks the kind of delicacy one finds in virtue, is not the former always more sublime? Does it not unfailingly have a character of grandeur and sublimity, which surpasses and will make it preferable to the monotonous and lackluster charms of virtue? Will you protest the greater usefulness of this or of that? Is it for us to scan nature's laws, ours to determine whether vice, being just as necessary to nature as a virtue, that virtue she perhaps does not implant in us in equal quantity the penchant for one or the other, de- depending upon the respective needs? But let us proceed. Trying to explain himself. All right, here we go. Here's a description of our four libertines, as they are called. The Duc de Blanges was at 18, the master of an already colossal fortune, which his latter speculators, with much increased, experienced all the difficulties which ascended like a cloud of locusts upon a rich and influential young man, who need not deny himself anything. It almost always happens in such cases that the extent of one's vices, and one stints oneself with much less and more, one has the means to procure oneself with everything. Do you ever have a dream that you wanted him to do you so much that you would do anything? Eh, ba ba ba. Had the Duke received a few elementary qualities from nature, they might possibly have counterbalanced the dangers which beset him in his position, but the curious mother, who seems to collaborate with such in order that the latter may favor every vice she gives to certain beings of whom she expects expectation, never different from these virtues supposes, and this because has just as much need of one as the other. Nature, I say, shut the fuck up about nature, Jesus. Nature, I say, in destining Blanges for immense wealth, had meticulously endowed him with every impulse, every inspiration required for its abuse. Together with a tenebrous and very evil mind, she had accorded him a heart of flint and an utterly criminal soul, and these were accompanied by the disorders in taste and irregularity of whim whence were born in the dreadful libertinage in which the Duke was in no common measure addicted. Born treacherous, harsh, imperious, barbaric, selfish, as lavish in the pursuit of pleasure, as miserly when it were a question of useful spending, a liar, a gourmand, a drunk, a dastard, a homosexual, a fond of going bowling with the family, giving to wine tasting, and setting things on fire and taking things that isn't his. No, not a single virtue was compensated to host such vices. Why, what I'm saying, not only did he never so much as dream of a single virtue, he beheld them all with horror, and he has frequently heard to say that he truly, happily in this world, a man ought no merely flinging himself into every vice, but would never permit himself one virtue, and that it was not simply a matter of doing evil, but also, and above all, never doing good. He likes being bad. He just took an entire page to say that. This thing has no right to be as big as it is. I'm going to burn this thing when I'm done. I don't care. I'm going to burn it. I need to calm down. Oh, there are plenty of people, the Duke used to observe, who never misbehave, since when passion spurs them to ill, latter the fire gone out of them, their now calm spirit peacefully returns to the path of virtue, and thus passing their life, going from strife to error, and from error to remorse. They end their days in such a way that there is no telling just what roles they have enacted on earth. Such persons, he would continue, must surely be miserable, forever drifting continually undecided their entire life, and spending detesting the morning in which they did the evening before, certain to repent the pleasures they taste. They take their delight in quaking in such sort. They become at once virtuous in crime and criminal in virtue. However, our hero would add, my more solid character is a stranger to these contradictions. I do my choosing without hesitation, and as I am always sure to find pleasure in the choice I make, never does regret arise and dull its charm. Firm in my principles, are because those are formed are sound and were formed very early. I always act in accordance with them, and they have made me understand the emptiness and nullity of virtue. I hate virtue, and never will I be seen resorting to it. This is one long paragraph. There are no indentations, nothing. I have to friggin' scan my finger across the page. This book is awful. Ah! I have no need to thwart my inclinations in order to flander some god. These instincts were given to me by nature, and it would be to irritate her were I to resist them. If she gave me bad ones, that is because they are necessary to her design. I am in her hands but a machine, which she runs as she likes, and not one in my crimes does not serve her. The more she urges me to commit them, the more of them in my way. The more of them she needs. I should not be a fool to disobey her. Thus nothing but the law stands in my way, but I defy the law. My gold and my prestige keep me well beyond reach of those vulgar instruments of repression which should be employed only upon the common sort. This man is a marquis, by the way, so chances are he actually believed this shit. In case you were wondering why this is supposed to be terrifying. If one were to raise the objection that nevertheless all men possess ideals of the just and the unjust which can only be the product of nature, since these notions are found in every person and even amongst the uncivilized, the Duke would reply affirmatively, saying that yes, these ideas never have been anything if not relative, that the stronger has always considered exceedingly just, that the weaker regarded as flagrantly unjust, and that it makes no more than the mere reversal of their positions. For oh my god, 2 more pages worth of friggin' no indentation. Each to be able to change his way of thinking too. Whence the Duke would conclude that nothing is really just but that makes for pleasure, And what is unjust is the cause of pain, that in taking 100 louis from a man's pocket, he was doing something very just for himself, although the victim of this robbery might have considered the action with another eye. And all these notions, therefore, being very arbitrary, a fool he would be to allow himself to become their thrall. It was by means of argument in this kind and Duke used to justify his transgressions. And as he was a man of greatest possible wit, his arguments had a deceptive ring, and so, modelling his conduct upon his philosophy, the Duke had from the most tender youth abandoned himself unrestrainingly to the most shameful extravagancies and to the most extraordinary ones. His father, having died young, and, as I indicated, left him in control of a huge fortune, had, however, stipulated in his will that the young man's mother should, while she lived, be allowed to enjoy a large share in his legacy. Such a condition was not in displeasing Blanchus. A poison appearing to be the only way to avoid having to subscribe to this article. The knave straightway decided to make use of it, but this was not the period but this was the period when he was only making his first steps in a vicious career. Not daring to act himself, he brought one of his sisters, with whom he was carrying on a criminal intrigue, to take charge of the execution, assuring her that if she were to succeed, he would see to it that she would be the beneficiary of that part of the fortune whereof death would deprive her mother. However, the young lady was horrified by this proposal, and the Duke, observing this ill-confided secret, was perhaps going to betray him, decided on the spot to extend his plans to include the sister, whom he had hoped to have for his compliance. He conducted both women to one of his properties, whence two unfortunate ones never returned. Nothing quite encourages as does one's first unpunished crime. This hurdle once cleared, an open field seemed to beckon to the Duke. Immediately, any person whosoever showed opposition to his desires, poison was exploited forthwith. With necessary murders, wine tastings. He soon passed to those of pure pleasure. He was captivated by the regrettable folly which causes us to find delight in the suffering of others. He noticed that a violent commotion inflicted upon any kind of adversary in answer by a vibrant thrill of our own nervous system, the effect of this vibration, giving energy to the animal spirits which flow within the nerves' concavities, obliges them to exert pressure on the chicken squawking nerves, and to produce, in accordance with this perturbation, what is termed a lubricious sensation. Consequently, he set about committing thefts and wine tastings in the name of debauchery and libertinage, just as someone who would be content, in order to inflame these passions, to chase a woman of the night or two. At the age of 23, he and three of his companions in vice, whom he had indoctrinated with philosophy, made up a party whose aim was to go out and stop a public coach at the highway, to force the men to go bowling with them among the travelers, along with the women, to take them to a wine tasting afterward, and to make off with their victims' money. The conspirators certainly had no need of this, and to be back at the same night, all three of them at the opera ball, in order to have a sound alibi. The crime took place. Yes, two charming maids were sent to a bowling tournament and tasted some wine. in their mother's arms, and to this was joined an endless list of other horrors, and no one dared suspect the Duke, weary of the delightful wife his father had bestowed upon him. Before dying, the young Blanges wasted no time in untying her shade to his mother's, to his sisters, and to those who were all other victims. Why all this? To be able to marry a girl, wealthy to be sure, but publicly dishonored, and whom he knew full well was her brother's mistress. What the heck? The person in question was the mother of Aline, one of the figures in our novel we mentioned above. Above. This book doesn't go up, it goes side to side. Strange language. This second wife, soon sacrificed, like the first, gave way to a third who followed hard on the heels of the second. Okay, so he's been killing his wives, basically. It was rumored abroad that the Duke's huge construction yeah, I'm getting a nose ache, was responsible for the undoing of all of his wives, and as this gigantic tale corresponded in every point to its organic inspiration, the Duke let the opinion take root and veil the truth. That dreadful colossus had indeed made one think of Hercules or a centaur. Really? They thought that his chicken did the killing? Took me a second. I was like, wait, was he building something? Is there something like a statue or what? No, it's talking about chickens. Blanges stood. Okay, finally we're getting an actual friggin' description. Okay, Blanges stood 5'8" tall, had limbs of great strength and energy, powerful sinews, elastic nerves, in addition to that a proud and masculine visage, great dark eyes, handsome black eyelashes, an aquiline nose, fine teeth, a quality of health and exuberance, broad shoulders, a heavy chest, a well-proportioned figure withal, splendid hips, a superb donkey, the handsomest leg in the world. What? Is it actually talking about his legs, or is this more chicken talk? The handsomest leg in the world, an iron temperament, the strength of a horse, and the chicken of a veritable mule. Wondrously hirsute, blessed with the ability to bowl a perfect game any number of times within a given day at will, even at the age of 50, which was his age at the time, a virtual constant chicken, what's a good way of saying this? Chicken statue. There we go. A virtually constant chicken statue in this chicken whose dimensions were at an exact 8 inches of circumference and 12 for length overall. Oh no. I think the chicken did do the killing. All right. So he's a manlet. Like, I'm literally taller than this guy, but he has the world's largest chicken. Let's move on. And there you have the portrait of the Duc de Blanges, drawn as accurately as if you'd welded the pencil yourself. Wielded, sorry. But if this masterpiece of nature was violent in his desires, what was it like, great God, when crowned by drunken voluptuousness? 'Twas a man no longer, 'twas a raging tiger. Woe unto him who happened then to be serving its passions. Frightful cries, atrocious blasphemies sprang from the duke's swollen melons. Oh, what the hell is a swollen chicken? I guess. I guess it starts with a B, but I've never seen that. It looked like the word that I will be using for melons. Flames seemed to dart from his eyes. He foamed at the mouth. He whinnied like a stallion. You'd have taken him for the very god of lust. Whatever then was his manner of having his pleasure, his hands necessarily strayed, roamed continually, and he had been more than once seen to strangle women to wine tastings. At the instant of his perficious At the instant of his bowling a strike, his presence of mind was restored. His frenzy was immediately replaced by the most complete indifference to the infirmities wherewith he had just indulged himself. And of this indifference, of the kind of apathy, further sparks of lechery would be born almost at once. In his youth, the Duke had been known to bowl a perfect game as often as 18 times a day, and all of that without appearing a jot more fatigued after the final than after the initial bout of bowling. 7 or 8 crises within the same interval still held no terrors for him, his half a century of years notwithstanding. For roughly 25 years he had accustomed himself to For 25 years he had accustomed himself with passive male on male bowling. I don't know. I already said homosexuality earlier, so and he withstood its assaults with the identical vigor characterized his manner of delivering them actively when, the very next moment, it pleased him to engage in such roles. He had once wagered he could sustain 55 attacks a day, and so he had. Furnished, as we have pointed out, with prodigious strength, he needed only one hand to go bowling with a woman, and he had proved it upon several occasions. One day he boasted he could squeeze the life out of a horse with his legs. He mounted the beast, it collapsed at the instant he had predicted. His prowess at the table outshone, if that is possible, what he demonstrated upon the bed. There's no imagining what had come to the quantity of the food he consumed. He regularly ate 3 meals a day, and they were all exceedingly prolonged and exceedingly copious, that it was as nothing to him to toss down his usual 10 bottles of Burgundy. Of Burgundy? There's a drink called Burgundy? Wow. He had drunk up to 30, and needed but to be challenged, and he would set out to the mark of 50, but his intoxication taking on the tinge of his passions and liqueurs or wines having heated his brain, he would wax furious, and that they would be obliged to tie him down, and despite all of that, would you believe it, a steadfast child might have hurled this giant into a panic. True indeed it was that the spirit often poorly corresponds with the chicken enveloping it. As soon as Blangus discovered he could no longer use his treachery or his deceit to get it away with. My eye is itchy. To get away with his enemy, he would become timid and cowardly, and the mere thought of even the mildest combat, but fought on equal terms, would have sent him fleeing to the ends of the earth. He had nevertheless, in keeping with his customs, been in one or two campaigns, but had acquitted himself to so disgracefully that he retired from the service at once, justifying his turpitude. The hell? Justifying his turpitude with equal amounts of cleverness and effrontery, he loudly proclaimed that his poltroonery. Use English words, please. I know this is a French book, but goodness, being nothing other than the desire to preserve himself, it were perfectly impossible for anyone in his right senses to condemn it for a fault. Keep in mind the identical moral traits, next adapt them to the entity. Okay, we're moving on. Keep in mind the identical moral traits. Next, adapt them to the entity from the physical point of view indefinitely inferior to the one who was just described. There you have the portrait of the Bishop of X, the Duc de Blange's brother. The same black soul and the same penchant for crime, the same contempt for religion and the same atheism, the same deception and cunning, a yet more supple and adroit mind, however, and more art in guiding his victims to their doom, but a slender figure, not heavy, no, a little thin body, wavering health, very delicate nerves, a greater fastidiousness in the pursuit of pleasure, mediocre prowess, a most ordinary chicken, even small but deft, profoundly skilled in management, each time yielding no little than his incessantly inflamed imagination could render him even capable of delight as frequently as his brother. His sensations were of a remarkable acuteness. He would experience an irritation so prodigious that he would often fall into a deep swoon upon bowling a strike, and he would always temporarily lose consciousness when doing so. He was 45, had delicate features, rather attractive eyes, but a foul mouth and ugly teeth, a hairless, pallid body, a small yet supple donkey, and a prick and and a chicken 5 inches around and 6 in length. An idol wait, an idolater and active and passive an idolater of active and passive homosexuality, but eminently of the latter. He spent his life having himself, well, being the submissive in a bowling tournament, going second in bowling. There we go. He spent his life having him going second in bowling, and this pleasure, which never requires much expense of energy, was best suited to the modesty of his means. Modesty? He's 6 inches. That's not. Come on, man. That's above average, if anything. Ugh. We will speak of his other traits in good time, but what regards those of the table, he carried them nearly as far as the Duke, but went about the matter with somewhat more sensuality. Monseigneur, no less of a criminal than his elder brother, possessed characteristics which had doubtless permitted him to match the celebrated feats of the hero we painted a moment ago. We will content ourselves with citing one of them. 'Twill be enough to make the reader see of what such a man may be capable, and what he was prepared and disposed to do, having done the following. One of his friends, a powerful man, and rich, had formerly had an intrigue with the young noblewoman who had been born him two children, a boy and a girl. He had, however, never been able to wed her, and the maiden had become another's wife. The unlucky girl's lover died while still young, but the owner, howbeit a tremendous fortune, having no kin to provide for it, it occurred to him to bequeath all he had to the two ill-fated children his affair had produced. On his deathbed he made the bishop privy of his intentions, and entrusted him with two immense endowments. He divided the sum, but in two purses, and gave them to the bishop, confiding the two orphans' education to the man of God, and enlisting him to pass on to each what was to be able to be his when they attained their majority. At the same time he enjoined the prelate to invest his ward's funds so that in the meantime they would double in size. He also affirmed that it was his design to leave the offspring's mother in eternal ignorance of what he was doing for them, and he absolutely insisted that none of this should ever be mentioned to her. These arrangements concluded the dying man's closed eyes, and Monsieur found himself master of a million in banknotes and two children. The scoundrel was not long deliberating in his next step. The dying man had spoken to no one about him, and the mother was to know nothing. The children were only 4 and 5 years old. He circulated the intelligence that his friend, upon expiring, had left his fortune to the poor. The rascal acquired in the same day. But to ruin left his fortune to the poor. The rascal acquired it the same day, but to ruin those wretched children did not suffice. Furnished with authority by their father the bishop, who never committed one crime without instantly conceiving another, had the children removed from the remote pension in which they were being brought up, and placed them under the roof of a certain people in his hire, from the outset having resolved to soon make them serve in his bowling tournaments. So he just stole their money, and then, don't linger on it. Don't linger on it. It's only going to get worse. You know that. He waited until they were 13. The little boy was the first to arrive at that age. The bishop put him to use. Bent him to all his debauches, and as he was extremely pretty, went bowling with him for a week. But the little girl's fairness less well. She reached the prescribed age, but was very ugly, a fact which had no mitigating effect upon the bishop's willingness to bowl. His desires appeased, he feared lest these children, left alive, would some day discover something of the secret of their interests. Therefore he conducted them to an estate belonging to his brother, and sure of recapturing by means of a new crime the sparks of lechery enjoyed, had just caused him to lose the immolated both. My nose gets very itchy, and I don't know why. Lechery, where is it saying? Both of these caused him to lose. He immolated both of them to his furious passions, and accompanied their death with episodes so poignant and so cruel that his voluptuousness was reborn in the midst of the torments wherein he beset them. So he had a little wine tasting party in a bowling tournament, and then, the thing is, unhappily, only too well known. There is no libertine, at least a little steeped in vice, who is not aware of the great way that wine tastings exert over the senses, and how voluptuously it determines a strike. And that is a general truth whereof it were well the reader be earlier advised before undertaking the pursuit of work which will be surely attempted by attempt an ample development of this system. Henceforth, at ease in the face of whatever might transpire, Monseigneur returned to Paris to enjoy the fruits of his misdeeds, and without the least qualms about having contracted the intentions of a man who, in his present situation, was in no state to deprive either pain or pleasure therein. Two down, two to go. The President de Serval was a pillar of society, only 60 years of age and worn by debauchery to a singular degree. He offered the eye not much more than a skeleton. He was tall, he was dry, thin, had two blue lustrous eyes, a vivid and unwholesome mouth, a prominent chin, a long nose, hairy as a satyr, flat-backed, with a slack and drooping donkey that rather resembled a dirty pair of rags, flapping upon his upper thighs. Stop! The skin of that donkey was, thanks to the whip-strokers, so deadened and toughened that you could seize up a handful and knead it without having his feeling a thing. So he's just completely desensitized to anything you could do to it. Okay. In the center of it all, there was displayed no need to open the donkey's mouth. An immense mouth, whose enormous diameter, odor, and color bore a closer resemblance to the depths of a well-frightened privy than of a donkey's mouth. And, crowning touch these allurements was numbered among this gay pig, little something or other, that of always leaving this particular part of himself in such a state of uncleanliness that one was at all times to observe a rim or pad a good 2 inches thick. Okay. So chocolate is covering the donkey's mouth like it's a friggin' donut. Oof. Oof, 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 oof. Below a belly of wrinkles, as it was livid and gummy, one perceived within a forest of hairs a chicken which, in its No, I am not stalling, so I don't have to read this next part. Which in its statue-like state stood no longer than 8 inches tall and 7 feet around. But this condition, and 7 inches around, not, wow. Ugh. But this condition had come to be the most rare, and to procure it was a furious sequence of things, was the necessary preliminary. You had to do a lot to actually make the chicken stand up. Nevertheless, the event occurred at least 2 or 3 times a week. It only happens 87 times a day. Nevertheless, and upon these occasions, the president would glide into every donkey's mouth that could be found, indiscriminately, although that of a young lad's donkey was infinitely the most precious to him. The head of the president's chicken was now at all times exposed, for he had himself a shaved chicken, just a beakless chicken. I don't know. A ceremony which largely facilitates enjoyment, and to which all pleasure-loving persons ought to submit. But one of the purposes of the same operation is to keep his chicken cleaner. Nothing of the sort in Serval's case. This part to him was just as filthy as the other. This uncapped head, beakless chicken, I guess, unnaturally quite thick to begin with, was thus made an inch ampler in circumference, similarly untidy about all the rest of his person. The president, who furthermore had tastes at the very least as nasty as his appearance, had become a figure of whose rather malodorous vicinity might not have succeeded in pleasuring everyone. However, his colleagues were not at all of the sort to be scandalized by such trivialities, and they were simply avoided discussing the matter with him. Few mortals had been as free in their behavior as debauches as the president, but entirely jaded, absolutely besotted, all remained to him was the deprivation and lewd, profligate bowling tournaments. Above 3 hours of excess, and the most outrageous excess, were needed before one could hope to inspire a standing up chicken for him. As for his bowling pins, although the Serval although in Serval the phenomenon was far more frequent than his standing chicken, and could be observed once every day, it was, at the same time, so difficult to obtain, or it never occurred save as an aftermath to things so strange and often so cruel or unclean, the agents of pleasure not commonly renounced the struggle, feigning by the wayside, the which would give birth in him to a kind of lubricious anger, and this, though its effects would now and again triumph, whereas his efforts had failed, Serval was to a point mired down in the morass and vice of libertinage that it had become virtually impossible for him to think or speak of anything else. His unending he unendingly had the most appalling expressions in his youth, just as he had the vilest designs in his heart, and these surpassing energies had mingled with the blasphemies and imprecations imprecations supplied him by his true horror. A segment he shared with his companions of everything that smacked of religion. This order of mind, this disorder of mind, yet further augmented by the most continual intoxication in which he was fond of himself, had during the past few years given him an air of imbecility and of prostration which he would declare made for his most cherished delight. Born as a great gourmand, as a drunk, he alone was fit to keep abreast the Duke, and in course of this tale we will behold him to perform wonders which no doubt astonish the most veteran eaters. Oh, he likes to eat a lot of chocolate, evidently. There's so much archaic language in this that it goes over my head and I can't censor any of it. But I need to get through this book, so I'm sorry. Dang. It had been years since Serval had, stopped bowling. His judicial duty. Oh, it was. Sorry. It had been 10 years since Serval had ceased to discharge his judicial duties. It was not simply that he was no longer fit to carry them out, but I even believe that while he had been there, he may have been asked to leave these matters alone for the rest of his life. So he just stopped being a judge for some reason. He was asked to step down. Serval had led a very libertine life. Every sort of perversion was familiar to him, and those who knew him personally had the strong suspicion that he owed his vast fortune to nothing other than 2 or 3 wine tastings. However, that may be, it is, in the light of the following story, highly probable that this variety extravagance had the power to stir him deeply, and it is in this adventure, which extracted some unfortunate publicity, that was responsible for his execution from the court. We are going to relate the episode in order to give the reader an idea of his character. There dwelled in the neighborhood of Serval's townhouse a miserable street porter who the father of a charming little girl, was ridiculous enough to be the person of sensibility. What? 20 messages of every kind had already arrived containing proposals to the poor fellow's daughter. He and his wife had remained unshaken despite his barrage aimed at their corruption, and Serval, the source of these embassies, only irritated by the growing number of refusals they had invoked, knew not that the tack to take in order to get his hands upon the girl and to subject her to lubricious caprices, until it struck to him that by simply having the father broken, he would lead the daughter to his bowling room. The thing was as nicely conceived as executed. 2 or 3 bullies in the president's pay intervened in the suit, and before the month was out, the wretched porter was enmeshed in an imaginary crime which had seemed to have been committed at his door, and which got him speedily lodged in the dungeons. I have no idea what that word is. The president, as one would expect, soon took charge of the case, and having no desire to permit it to drag on, arranged in the space of 3 days, thanks to his knavery and his gold, to have the unlucky porter condemned to be broken on the wheel, without the culprit ever having committed any crime, but that of wishing to preserve his honor and his daughter's safety. Ooh, the wheel? So basically, you're tied to a wheel, and you're friggin' spun around, while some dude takes a hammer and breaks every bone in your body. Then you're just on a wheel. Your weight is constantly shifting, and you can feel the bones rattling around, and it's the worst kind of death. Are you kidding me? Yeesh. I know, it's the Marquis de Sade. What the heck else am I expecting? But really, this is terrible. Sorry for the frizzy hair or whatever. I just got out of the shower. I just got tired of the smell. Meanwhile, the solicitations were renewed. The mother was brought in. It was explained to her that she alone had been left in her power to save her husband, that if she were to go bowling with the president, what would be cleaner than he would therefore snatch her husband from the dreadful fate awaiting him. Further hesitation was impossible. The woman made inquiries. Serval knew perfectly well to whom she addressed herself. The counsels were his creatures, and they gave her unambiguous replies. She ought not waste a moment. The poor woman herself brought her daughter weeping to the judge's feet. The latter could not have been more liberal with his promises, nor have been less eager to keep his word. Not only did he fear lest were he to deal honorably and spare the husband, the man might raise an uproar upon discovering the price that had been paid to save his life. But the scoundrel even found a further delight, a yet keener one, in arranging to have himself given what he wished without being obliged to make any return. This thought led to others, numerous criminal possibilities entering his head, and their effect was to increase his bowling power. And this is how he set about to put the blah 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 blah. And this is how he set about the manner so as to put the maximum of infamy and piquancy into this scene. His mansion stood facing a spot where criminals were sometimes executed in Paris, and as this particular offense had been committed in the quarter of the city, he won assurance the punishment would be meted out at this particular square. The wretch's wife and daughter arrived at the president's home at the spotted hour. All windows overlooking the square were well shuttered, so that from the apartments he assumed himself with his victims, nothing at all could be seen of what was going on outside. Apprised of the exact minute of execution, the rascal selected it for the deflowering of the girl. who had been held in her mother's arms, and everything was so happily arranged that Serval bowled a perfect game with the girl's donkey the moment her father was killed. Instantly he'd completed his business. "Come have a look," quoth he, opening a door upon the square. "Come see how well I have kept my bargain." And one of the two princesses saw her father, the other her husband, delivering up his soul to the headsman's steel. Both collapsed in a faint, but Serval had provided for everything. This swoon was their agony. They'd been poisoned, and never more opened their eyes. Wow, I want to get off the ride already. You liking this so far? It's the worst book ever written. It gets worse. Notwithstanding the precautions he had taken to the swath of the whole of this exploit in their most profound misery, something did indeed transpire. Nothing was known of the women's death, but their existence a lively suspicion. He had been untruthful in his connection with the husband's case. His motive was half known, and his eventual retirement from the bench was the outcome. As of this moment, no longer having to maintain appearances, Serval flung himself into new ocean of errors and crimes. He sent everywhere for his victims to sacrifice to the perversity of his tastes. Throughout an atrocious refinement of cruelty, but one, however, was easily understood. The downtrodden classes were upon which he most enjoyed hurtling the effects of his raging perfidy. He had several minions who were brought about night and day, scouring antics and hovels, tracking down whatever the most destitute misery might be able to provide, and under the pretext of dispensing aid, either he envenomed his catch. To give poison was one of the most delectable pastimes, or he lured it to the house and slew it upon the altar of his perverse preferences. Men, women, children, anything was to fuel his rage, and it is abiding he performed exercises which he had got his head between block and blade 1,000 times over, were not for the sliver he distributed, and the esteem he enjoyed, factors whereby he was 1,000 times protected. One may well imagine such a being had no more religion than his two confeers. He would without a doubt detest it as sovereignty as they, but in past years had done more to wither it in others, for in the days when his mind had been sound, it had also been clever, and he had put into it good use writing religion. He had the author of several works whose influence had been prodigious, and these successes, always present in his memory, still constituted one of the dearest delights. The more we multiply the objects of our enjoyment, the portrait of Dorset, the years of sickly childhood. I think the book is having a stroke. I don't know what this means. Anyways, Dorset. He is 53. He is small, short, broad, thick-set, an agreeable, hearty face, of very white skin. His entire body, and principally his hips and his donkey, were completely like that of a woman's. His donkey is cool and fresh. Cool and fresh? What? Cool. I have no idea. I have no clue. Chubby and firm, dimpled but aggressively agape. But aggressively open. Okay. Owing to the habit of homosexuality. His chicken is extraordinarily small. 'Tis scarcely 2 inches around, no more than 4 inches long. It was entirely creased in. It has entirely ceased to stand. His bowling is rare and uneasy. far from abundant, and always preceded by spasms which hurl his chicken into a kind of fervor which, in turn, conducts him to crime. He has a chest like a woman's, a sweet, pleasant voice, and, when in society, the best bred manners, although his mind is without question as depraved as his colleagues, a schoolmate of the Duke. They still sport together every day, and one of Dorset's lofty pleasures is to have his donkey's mouth tickled by the Duke's very large chicken. And such, dear reader, are the four villains in whose company I am going to have you pass a few months. I have done my best to describe them. If, as I have wished, I have made you familiar with their most secret depths, nothing in the tale of their various follies will astonish you. I have not been able to enter into minute detail with what regards their tastes. To have done so now would have been to impair the value and to the harm of the main scheme of this work. But as we move progressively along, you will be able to keep an attentive eye upon our heroes, and you will have no trouble discerning their characteristics. Their characteristic peccadillos. This book just slips in and out of making sense for me, and I have no idea how to read it. I should not have chosen this book as the thing to read. Actually, I do have Clive Barker's Books of Blood. I should have just read that. Oh well. Oh well, I started this, I may as well keep going. And the particular types of voluptuous mania which best suits the each of them. Roughly, all we can say at this present time is that they are generally susceptible of an enthusiasm for homosexuality, that the four of them had themselves bowled into regularly, and that they all worshipped donkeys. The Duke, however, relative to the immensity of his chicken, and doubtless more through cruelty than from taste, still went bowling with kitty cats with the greatest pleasure. So also did the president, but less frequently. As for the bishop, which was his supreme loathing for the mere sight of a cat. We haven't even talked about, kitty cats yet. Anyways, he never in his life ever went bowling with one. That belonged to his sister-in-law, and expressly to beget a child wherein some day to procure himself the pleasures of going bowling with his family. We haven't seen how well he succeeded. As regards Dorset, he certainly idolized the donkey with as much fervor as the bishop, but his enjoyment of it was more of an accessory. His favorite attacks were directed toward a third sanctuary. This mystery was unveiled in the sequel. I don't know what it's talking about. Both on the portraits of the essential to the intelligence of his work, and let us now have our reader an idea of the worthy husband's four wives. What a contrast! Constance. Oh, we're describing the girls now. What a contrast! Constance, the Duke's wife and the daughter of Dorset, was a tall, slender, lovely as a picture, and modelled as if the Grace had been taken pleasure in embellishing her. But the elegance of her figure is in no way distracted from her freshness. She was not for that less plumpy fleshed, and most delicious forms graced by skin and fairer than the lily, often introduced one to suppose that, no, it had been love itself who had undertaken her formation. Her face was a trifle long, her features wonderfully noble, whose majesties than graceness was in her look, more grandeur than subtlety. Her eyes were large, black, and full of fire, her mouth extremely small and ornately and ornamented with the finest teeth imaginable. She had a narrow, supple tongue and the loveliest of the loveliest pink. Yes, okay. I was going to say kitty cat. Blah. And her breath was sweeter than the scent of a rose. She was fully meloned, and her melons were buxom, fair as alabaster and firm. Her back was turned in an extraordinary way, its lines sweeping deliciously down to the most aristocratically and the most precisely toned donkey nature had produced in a long time. Nothing could have been more perfectly round, not very large, but firm, white dimpled, and it was opened. What used to be a peep, but now the cleanest, most wholesome, most delicate of donkeys' mouths. A nuance of tenderest pink had shaded this donkey. Charming asylum of lubricity, sweetest pleasures, but great God, it was not for long to preserve so many charms. 4 or 5 attacks and the Duke had spoiled all of those graces. How quickly they had gone, and soon after her marriage, Constance had become no more than the image of beauty of a beautiful lily, wherein the temptress had a late but stripped the petals away. 2 round and perfectly modelled thighs supported another temple, in all likelihood less delicious, but too inclined to worship there. Offering so many allurements, it would have been in vain were my pen to strive to describe them. Constance was almost a virgin. Then the Duke married her, and her father, the only man who had known her, had, as they say, left that side of her perfectly intact. The most beautiful black hair falling in unnatural curls to below her shoulders, and then one wished it thus, reaching down to the pretty fur in the same color which shaded that voluptuous kitty cat, made for further adornment. I might have been guilty of omitting and lent the angelic nature. Age of 22, all charms nature is able to lavish upon a woman. To all these amenities Constance enjoyed a fair and agreeable wit, a smart somewhat more elegant than it ought to have been, considering the melancholy situation fate had awarded her. For therefore she was established. I think this mask is doing something to my head right now. Ah. For thereby she was enabled to sense all its horrors, and doubtless she would have been happier if furnished with less delicate perceptions. Dorset, who had raised her more as if she were a courtesan than his daughter, and who had been much more concerned to give her talents than manners, had all the same never been able to totally destroy the principles of rectitude and of virtue it seemed nature had been pleased to engrave in her heart. She had no formal religion. No one had ever mentioned such a thing to her. The exercise of belief was not to be tolerated by her father's household, but all that had not been blotted by her modesty, the natural humility which has nothing to do with theological chimeras, and which, when it dwells in an upright, decent, and sensitive soul, it is difficult to obliterate. Get whatever meaning you can from that. Never had she stepped outside of her father's house, and the scoundrel had forced her, beginning at the age of 12, to go bowling with him. She found a world of difference in those the Duke embitted with her. Her body was noticeably altered in these formidable dimensions, and the day after the Duke had despoiled her, and her maidenhead, soderingly speaking, she had fallen dangerously ill. They believed that her donkey's mouth had been irreparably damaged, But her youth, her health, and some sultry local remedies soon restored the use of the forbidden avenue for the Duke and the luckless Constance, forced to accustom herself to this daily torture. And it was but one amongst others, entirely recovered and became adjusted to everything. This is taking forever. I'm so sorry. Adelaide, Durset's wife and the father of the president, had a beauty which was perhaps superior to Constance's, but of an entirely different sort. She was 20, small, slender, and of slightly delicate build, of classical loveliness, and had the fairest blonde hair to be seen. An interesting air, a look of sensibility, distributed everywhere about her, and above all in her features, gave her the quality of a heroine in a romance story. Her exceptionally large eyes were blue. They expressed at once tenderness and decency. Two long, narrow, and remarkably drawn eyebrows adorned a forehead not very high, but in a very noble charm. One might have thought this were modesty's very temple. Her nose, thin, a little pinched at the top, ascended to assume a semi-aquiline contour. Her lips inclined toward the thin. They were bright, ripe, red, a little large. Her mouth was the unique flaw in the celestial no. But when it opened, there shone two pearls nature seemed to have sown into amidst roses. What? She only had two teeth? What the hell? Ugh. Nature seemed to have amidst roses. Her neck was a shade long, attached in a singularly way, with only judged a natural habit. Her head was ever so faintly bent towards her right shoulder, especially when she was listening. Sorry, I'm allergic to terrible literature. But with what grace did not intend attested attitude endowed her. Her melons were very small, very round, very firm and well elevated, but they were barely enough there to fill the hand. They were like two little apples of a frolicking Cupid's head had fetched hither from his mother's garden. Her chest was narrow, it was also very delicate, and her belly was satin smooth, a little blonde mound, not much furnished with hair, served as percentile to the temple in which Venus seemed to call out her homage. This kitty cat was narrow, such as a point you could not insert a finger therein without eliciting a cry from Adelaide. Therefore, two lustrums had received since the time when, thanks to the president, the poor child had ceased to be a virgin. Either in the place or in the delicate, delicious parts it remains for us to sketch. Oh, what were the attractions the secondary possessed? What a flow in line with her back! How magnificently were those donkeys cut! What whiteness there, and what dazzling rose blush! But all in all, it was on the small side, delicate in all her lines. She was rather the sketch than the model of her beauty. It seemed as though nature had only wished to indicate in Adelaide what she had so majestically articulated in Constance. Peer into that appetizing donkey, and lo, a rosebud would offer itself to your gaze. And it was all in bloom, and in the most tenderest pink. Nature wished you to behold it, but narrow, thin, it had only been in the place to infinite labors the president had navigated throughout these straits, and had only renewed those assaults successfully two or three. Dorset, less extravagating, gave her little affection in this point, but since becoming his wife in exchange for how many cruel compliances, with what quantity of those perilous submissions had she not been obliged to purchase this little kindness, and therefore turned over the four libertines, as by their mutual consent she was. How many other cruel ordeals had she not to undergo, but the but the species Dorset had spared her, and of every other? Adelaide had the mind her face suggested, that is to say, an extremely romantic mind. Solidarity placed where were the ones she preferred, and once there she would have shed involuntary tears. Tears to which we do not pay it sufficient heed. Tears apparently torn from nature's foreboding. She had recently bereft a friend, a girl she idolized, and this frightful loss constantly haunted her imagination. She was thoroughly acquainted with her father, and she knew to what extents he carried his wildest behavior. She was persuaded her young friend had fallen prey to the president's villainies, for he had never managed to induce the missing person to accord him in certain pleasures. The thing was not unlikely. Adelaide imagined the same would befall her, nor was it improbable. The president, in her regard, had not paid the same attention to the problem of religion. Dorset had in the interests of Constance. No, he had endured in that nonsense to be born, to be formed, supposing that his writings and discourses would be easily destroyed. He was mistaken. Religious in the So he thought that she was going to be rebellious about the whole religion thing, but she wasn't. But she actually became super religious. And holy crap, if I lived in this family, yeah, I'd take the God immediately. This book needs Jesus. Everything here needs Jesus. Everything. All of it. Religion is the nourishment upon which a soul such as Adelaide feeds. In vain the president had preached, in vain he had made her read books. The young lady had remained a believer, and all of these extravagancies which she did not share, which she hated, of which she was the victim, fell far short of disabusing her from the illusions which continued to make from her life's happiness. She would go and hide herself to pray to God. She'd perform Christian duties on the sly, and was unfailing, and even severely punished either by her father or her husband. Was surprised in the act by one or the other. Adelaide patiently endured it all, fully convinced heaven would some day reward her. Her character was as gentle as her spirit, and her benevolence one of the virtues of which her father had most detested in her. Went to the point of extreme. My body wants to do anything else other than read this book. I'm sorry. Serval, whom had that vile class of the poverty-stricken irritated, sought only to humiliate it, to further depress it, or to right victims from it. His generous daughter, on the other hand, would have forgone her own necessities to procure them for the poor, and had she not been espied stealing off to take the needy sums which were intended for her pleasures, Dorset and the president finally succeeded in scolding and pounding good manners in her, and in ridding her of the corrupt practice by withholding absolutely all means whereby she could resume it. Adelaide, having nothing left but her tears to bestow upon the poor, went none the less to sprinkle them upon her woes, and her powerless, howbeit staunchy sensitive spirit was incapable of ceasing to be virtuous. One day she learned that some poor woman had come to make a woman of the night of her daughter to the president, because the extreme need bade her to do so. The enchanted old rake was already preparing himself for the kind of pleasure-taking he liked best. Adelaide had one of her dresses sold, and immediately got the money to put it into the mother's hands. By means of the small assistance and some sort of sermon, she diverted the woman from what she was about to commit. Hearing what she had done, the president proceeded to do such violences upon her that her daughter had not yet married at the time. She was a fortnight abed, but all that was to no avail. Nothing could put a stop to this gentle soul's tender impulses. Cool, so I have my favorite character, and let's read on and see terrible things happen to her. Yay! Julie, the president's wife, the duke's eldest daughter, would have eclipsed the two preceding women were it not for something which many beheld as a capital defect, but which had, perhaps in itself, aroused Serval's passion for her. So true it was that the effects of passion are unpredictable, nay, inconceivable in their disorder, the outcome of disgust and satiety. And satiety, yep, that's what that says, can only be matched by their irregular flights. Julie was tall, made although was tall, well made, although quite fat and fleshy, had the most lovely brown eyes in the world, a charming nose, striking and facious features, and the most beautiful chestnut brown hair, a fair body of the most appetizing fullness, a donkey which might easily have served as a model of one of those praxitelid sculpted. Her kitty cat was hot, straight, and yielded as agreeable a sensation that such a locale ever may. Her legs were handsome. Why? Why are the legs handsome? I don't understand. Her agreeable a sensation as a locale, her feet charming. But she had the worst decked mouth, the foulest teeth, and was, by habit, so dirty in every part of her body, in principle, at the two temples of lubricity, that no other may let me repeat it, no other but the president himself would elect to subject himself to the same shortcomings in question, subject to the same shortcomings and unquestionably fond of them. Nay, no one else, despite all her allurements, could have put up with Julie. Serval, however, was mad about her. His most divine pleasures were gathered upon that stinking mouth. To kiss it plunged in him delirium, and as for his natural uncleanliness, far from rebuking her for it, to the contrary, he encouraged her, and had finally got her accustomed to a perfect divorce from water. He just straight up told this bitch not to drink any water. What the heck? To these faults, Julie had added a few others, but they were severely less disagreeable, and she was a vast eater. She had a leaning towards drunkenness, little virtue, and I believe that she may have dared try it. She liked getting nasty. Would have held very little way of terror for her. Brought up by the Duke in a total abandon of principles innate and manners, she adopted, a woman of the knight's philosophy, and she was probably an apt student in all its tenets. But though yet another, yet very curiously effect of libertinage, it often happens that a woman who shares very curious effect of libertinage, it often happens that a woman who shares our faults pleases us as a great ideal less in our pleasures than one who is full of naught but virtues. The first resembles us, we scandalize her not, the other is terrified, and there is one very certain charm more. Despite his proportions, the Duke had spotted with his daughter, but he had had to wait until she was 15, and even so had not been able to prevent Julie from being considerably damaged by the venture. Indeed, so much so that, eager to marry her off, he had been forced to put a term to He had forced then to put a term on the bowling, taking this variety to the content with delights less dangerous for her, but at least as fatiguing. Yeah. Julie gained a little by gaining the president, whose chicken, as we know, was exceedingly thick, and furthermore, however, which she was dirty from neglect of herself, she would not in any wise keep by a foulness and debauch, such as one that distinguished the president, her beloved spouse. I'm not getting enough air. I'm not getting enough air. I have a lovely air freshener. Aline, Julie's sister, and really the daughter of the bishop, proposed habits and effects of the character very unlike her sister. She was most youthful of the four, and she had become 18. She had a fetching, exuberantly healthy, and almost pert little countenance. A little turned-up nose, brown eyes full of expression and a vivacity, a delicious little upturn, a mouth, a most shapely though somewhat tall figure, well fleshed, the skin a bit dark but soft and fine, a donkey rather on the supple side but well molded, a pair of the most voluptuous donkey cheeks that ever a libertine eye might behold, the love-mounded, brown-haired and pretty, the kitty cat a trifle low, or as they saw, a something in French, but as tight as one might wish, and she was presented to the assembly. She was thoroughly a maid, and she was still at the time the party where the chronicle got under way, and we shall see in the manner her maidenhead was annihilated. As for the first fruits of her donkey, the bishop had been peacefully plucked them every day for the past 8 years, but without, however, arousing in his dear daughter much of a taste for these exercises. She, despite her mischievous and randy air, only cooperated out of obedience, and had never hinted that she shared the slightest pleasure in the infamies whose daily victim she was. The bishop had left her in the most profound ignorance. Scarcely did she know how to read and write, and was absolutely no idea of religion's existence. Her mind was natural; it was that of a child. She would give droll replies. She liked to play. She loved her sister a great deal, detested the bishop out of all measure, and feared the duke as she dreaded fire. On the wedding day she was discovered herself naked and surrounded by all 4 men. She wept, and moreover did all that was asked of her, acting without pleasure as without ill temper. She was sober, very clean, and having no other fault but that of laziness, nonchalantness, reigned in all her movements and doings, and everywhere all about her personage. Despite the loveliness announced by her bright eyes, she abhorred the president almost as much as she hated her uncle, and Dorset, who treated her with no excess of consideration, none the less seemed to be the only one for whom she had no repugnance. These are the 8 principal characters in whose company we are going to enable you to live, good reader. It is now time to divulge the object of singular pleasures that were proposed. Let's see how much of that. Let me look at this. I haven't even made a dent in this story. But I already feel sick. All right. I'll do more reading tomorrow. But, yeah, same time, I guess. But don't expect me to be happy about it. I hope you hated this as much as I did. I'm going to be reading the Bible now. Goodbye. Goodbye.